So in your book, and you have a few of them, but this latest book that you have that just came out, Never Forget Our People Were Always Free, a parable of American healing. You talk a lot about how we are more related than we aren't, right?
Yeah.
So I'm reminding us every day, thanks to Dr. Great Carr, that we Black Africans are the parents of humanity.
Yes.
So I feel like we've had that role of parent snatched from us because of the 400-year interruption called in slavery
Yeah.
and colonization. But parents, need to take their rightful role. You talk about the mothers, you talk about Westmore's mom, your mom. I feel like we're not acting like good parents. We're acting like victims of a system, and the system is what it is. But we can correct this. So this book, you kind of blur the lines of race because everybody's a cousin. You open
Yeah.
up talking about Vice President Dick Cheney's horrible ass having a heart attack or whatever, and reminding us that he's like two or three of y'all's cousins.
Yes. Mine and
Dick
Barack Obama's. Mine and
yes.
Barack Obama.
So
Which
talk about
literally
that
David
conversation you had
Gregory
with Dick
got me.
Gregory.
I mean,
Yes.
I was on set of Meet the Press, and I look at David Gregory, I look like I ain't gonna say anything bad about him today because I just figured out he's my cousin. And he's like, ain't he like every Black person cousin? Because at the time, Dick Cheney was cousins to the first Black president and the president of the NAACP. So like mathematically, it might be possible.
Yo, it's like 3 degrees of Kevin Bacon and 6 degrees of Dick Cheney. We're all Dick Cheney. That something's disturbing about that. But walk through why that was an important, story to put in this. What is the framing?
It's yeah. So the couple things. One, when I figured out that Dick Cheney was my cousin and Robert E. Lee, the Confederate general, was my cousin, the country just felt like really small, and it definitely felt like God had a sense of humor because, there's one person that the head of the NAACP or the former head doesn't want to be related to, it would be Robert E. Lee.
Facts.
But it was also important because, I'll get to the framing of the book in a second. The way I discovered that was that I ultimately figured out that my grandmother's grandfather and his dad, my grandmother's great grandfather, were owned by a man who was the great grandfather's brother and the grandfather's uncle. And the tell was that this man who had many slaves only protected one in his will, and he had several sentences laying out how he should not be treated. And and he would only serve that man's sons, who of course were his nephews. And between that and our DNA and some other documents, the scholar Henry Louis Gates Jr. at Harvard was like, Ben, what's happening in this will is that the owner's dying, and he knows that his manservant, as he referred to, he didn't refer to him as a slave, that his manservant is his brother. And he's simply trying to protect his brother. Well, then I figured out that the owner, and therefore us, because we're all cousins to Robert E. Lee, and that they knew that. So there was an intimacy and a recognition of humanity. Because clearly, if he simply thought him chattel, he would not be trying to protect him. That these contradictions, people were, it wasn't just Thomas Jefferson, who was running around, quaking over the contradictions. This guy was about to die, and he felt an obligation to protect his brother, who was also enslaved by him.
Why not just free him?
I don't know, for real. What
I'm just like, yeah.
But what I would say
much
is
easier would that be?
All of this is on the eve of the Civil War, and the Civil War ends. And I believe part of the hubris of my ancestors, part of the hubris of my grandmother's grandfather in particular, who would go on to be the leader of the Black Republicans at the end of Reconstruction, before the beginning of Jim Crow in Virginia, was he's looked around, he's like if my white cousins, can lead the army, can do this, can do that, like, why can't I? And so he went right out there. And then here he was, like, imagine this, okay? This is a part of the book that just blew my mind. It's 1881. The reign of terror of the Ku Klux Klan has been incessant for 5 years. The former Confederates have been reenfranchised. The plantation owning class is reasserting their dominance over the state, their dominion over the state. working class white men bolt from the Democratic Party because the old plantation owners are talking about shutting down the public schools. And they create a third party called the Readjusters. Their demand is readjust the terms of the Civil War debt so we can keep our public schools. The public schools have been started by the radical black-led governments, the radical Republican governments of Reconstruction. But the whites benefited from it too. And their leader is a Confederate general, William B. Mahone, who blacks consider to be a war criminal because he massacred an entire black regiment at the Battle of the Crater after they surrendered. And my grandmother's grandfather, Edward David Bland, approaches that guy and says, let's form an alliance. Y'all want to keep the public schools? Well, we created them. We want to keep them too. And he leads blacks into the Readjusters. And the blacks, for a moment, are the largest party in Virginia. They take over the entire government. And you have a majority black party because of all the people that my grandmother's grandfather led into that party. They would outnumber the whites ultimately, led by a former Confederate general and a freeman. And in just a few short years, Karen, they radically expand Virginia Tech, making it the working person's rival to UVA that it remains today. They create Virginia State, the first public HBCU south of the Mason-Dixon. They saved the public schools, they abolished the whipping post, and they abolished the poll tax. And that was the part that kept me up for nights, just trying to kind of decode this, Karen, because you and I were taught in school that the poll tax was a response essentially to black power during Reconstruction. This was a way to put blacks back in their place. What teachers tended to gloss over, forget the fact that they never taught us that Confederates and freemen ever could, came together and took over anything, let alone multiple states. But they also never taught us that the poll tax, in addition to disenfranchise 80% of the blacks in places like Virginia, also disenfranchised fully half of the whites. And that populist rebellion that these two men led was much closer to 1902, when Virginia put the poll tax in the state constitution to keep it permanently, than it was to the Civil War. In other words, the poll tax was as much an attempt to squash multiracial populist rebellion as it was an attack on black power itself.
Ben Jealous is here. The book is Never Forget Our People Were Always Free. I'm going to get into the title in a second. I think I'm just sitting here stunned because, we were never taught this in school. Yeah. We were never taught that. I think roughly 85 to 90% of the people who fought in the Civil War on the side of the Confederates never owned any human beings. Right. The people who actually owned human beings didn't put their lives on the line. So people were fighting for something they did themselves. They were fighting to keep in slavery when they did not enslave people themselves. They fought for the aspiration to do so, I guess. That was it. They don't talk about that. And they definitely don't talk about Wilmington. They don't talk about what you just mentioned, public schools. So today, the public schools, to me, are failing because they do not teach truth. And now we have lawmakers all over the country banning books and preventing truth from being told. So where are we right now? Is the public school system broken to the point where we need to reimagine it or go back to the beginnings of it, where black people understood the power of really educating the children, the masses?
Biggest issue with the public schools right now, honestly, is that they're woefully underfunded. When I ran for governor, there were a couple of things that were consistent. One was that counties in Maryland were talking about the best teachers leaving to take jobs in places that would pay better, whether it was a private school or whether it was a different state. The second thing was that the teachers were decreasingly getting married and increasingly living in their 30s in 2-bedroom apartments with three roommates, 2 counties over in a county where the housing costs less. And where does that start? Well, as I talk about in my book, John Powell, a scholar now at UC Berkeley, went back and looked at media coverage of poverty and public support for public institutions. And what he found was that, say, in the Great Depression, the predominant face of poverty in America was white, and public support for everything public was at an all-time high. I think FDR and the New Deal. After the Civil Rights Movement, the public images, the media's representation of poor people was almost exclusively black and brown.
Why?
And public support for everything public cratered. I'm not sure why. Maybe stereotypes, maybe a sense of guilt that we kept the black poor invisible for so long in the media. Who knows? But that's what they did. Think about it. When you see an image of poverty, it's typically a black person. And The irony, of course, Karen, is that the largest number of people in America in poverty have always been white. They're the largest group. There's about 8 million blacks in poverty. There's about 16 million whites in poverty. And so the racism that stereotypes the poor as black ultimately hurts way more white people than black people. Right. And that's part of what I'm trying to get us to understand in this book is like, as angry as we are as black about racism, as much as it hurts, conversation with the police earlier today and my cousin, like, it's just incessant. It's all the time. And yet, numerically, set aside percentages. Lawyers always want to talk about percentages. They're important. I'm an organizer. What we care most about is how many people, how many families is this impacting? Well, there's twice as many whites trapped in poverty as blacks. And one of the things I get into the book is that actually was the purpose in the American definition of race in the beginning, was to split these two groups, diminish their power, and keep both of them trapped in poverty.
Mm. I'm going to push back. Ben Jealous,
Sure.
professor, organizer, author of Never Forget Our People Were Always Free. I don't think money is the issue. I covered education for 3 years on the editorial board of the New York Daily News, and New York City had one of the largest budgets in the history of budgets for schools. And in the predominantly black schools where the likelihood of a black boy being classified was much higher, 3 times the amount of money went to that black child, that black body, right? So there was value in classifying students. There was value in having them line up for Ritalin. There was monetary value, right? The life that you talk about with your ancestor. My mother grew up in a segregated Augusta, Georgia, Lucy Laney High School, which had very little money, but they had teachers that cared. Those black people that fought for education in public schools didn't have any money, but those kids that came out of that, we talk about Dunbar High School, we can talk about all these schools produce some greatness with no money. Money's not the issue. I think there's a lack of intention. I think there's a lack of intentionality. And I also think that for the last 20 plus years, we have taught students how to regurgitate learned information, how to memorize information and not how to think, not how to process, not how to actually build with their minds.
Critical thinking, yes.
Yeah, so that to me is more problem. And no money's going to fix that. This is all, to me, vision.
Yes, but I would say both and this is why, absolutely. Look, the kids we spend the most on in America are typically the kids who are incarcerated. In Connecticut, a decade ago, they were spending $400,000 a year on each child that was incarcerated. Money by itself doesn't fix anything, but when you're trying to retain your best teachers and they all keep leaving and you ask them why, well, money's always the answer. They're not being paid enough. And we forced the teachers in Maryland to take a pay cut during the recession and we never made them whole. So both and. Look, my grandmother would say that, watching her daughter, watching my mom sue her high school, I talk about this in the book, when she's 12, to be in the first class to desegregate Western High School in Baltimore when she's 15. Baltimore Western that year would have 10 black girls. My mom went back to visit with me a few years ago. He had 10 white girls, right? And what my grandma would say was that, and I would actually set Western aside, which I think does a pretty good job of loving their girls. But generally in the public schools, what existed during segregation was a lot of love for the children. The teachers were from the community. The kids were from the community. There was a lot of love. After segregation ended, union politics, etc., preference was given to white teachers. And you had a lot of teachers teaching not in their community, afraid of the community that they were teaching, and not motivated necessarily with the same type of love. Don't get me wrong. I've seen a lot of white teachers who love their kids. That's how my parents met. My dad was the white teacher at Harlem Park Junior High, and he loved his kids, and he went to jail for his kids, and he protested for his kids. And he went to jail because he didn't want them going to jail in the sit-ins. They were junior high school students and thought they were too young. And he got beaten up in jail for it. So there are heroic white teachers. But to your point about intentionality, the reality is that America has suffered because of a lack of love in too many classrooms, and we got to figure that out. So yes, there are multiple factors, but when you're trying to retain your best teachers, pay becomes the number one reason.
I agree. I think teachers should be paid as much as doctors and nurses.
Yes,
It's
absolutely.
just it's the same to me, the
Yeah.
same level of care, and way more than lawyers. Sorry,
Yeah.
been jealous. Sorry.